The blood-red sunset painted the Montana sky as Savannah Klein stood at the edge of her failing ranch, clutching the foreclosure notice with trembling hands. The year was 1885, and the harsh winter had claimed not only her cattle but her husband too, leaving her with nothing but debts and a wooden cross marking his grave beneath the old oak tree. At 24, she was a widow in a merciless land where women alone were considered little more than targets. 6 weeks, she whispered to the wind. 6 weeks to pay or I lose everything. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dying light. Savannah squinted, reaching for the rifle she kept propped against the porch railing. In these parts, strangers rarely brought good news. As the figure drew closer, she could make out a lean man astride a Palomino stallion. His black Stetson cast a shadow over features weathered by sun and hardship, but even from a distance, there was something in his posture that spoke of quiet confidence. "That's far enough," Savannah called out when he was within earshot. "State your business." The rider pulled his horse to a stop, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Name's Xavier Kane, looking for work, heard the Klein place might need hands." Savannah's laugh was bitter. "You heard wrong, Mr. Kane. This place is dying faster than the daylight. Can't afford to pay myself, let alone hire help." Xavier dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. Now that he stood before her, Savannah could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a scar that traced his jawline. "I don't need much, madam, just a place to stay and meals. Heading north eventually, but need somewhere to winter." Savannah studied him, trying to discern if there was deception behind those gray eyes. Men had tried to take advantage of her vulnerable position before thinking a widow alone would be desperate for companionship or protection. She'd sent them all away with a warning shot over their heads. "I've got nothing to offer you, Mr. Kane. Bank's about to claim this place anyway." Xavier glanced around at the fading ranch, the sagging fence line, the empty corral, the weathered barn that needed a fresh coat of paint 5 years ago. His expression revealed nothing, but something in his eyes shifted. "When's the bank coming?" 6 weeks. "Unless I can somehow produce $300, he nodded thoughtfully. "I've got skills beyond ranch work, Mrs. Klein, good with horses no one else can handle, can break the wildest Mustangs, split the profit." She wanted to send him away. The last thing she needed was another complication. But desperation had a way of making impossible choices seem reasonable. "You can sleep in the barn," she said finally. "First sign of trouble and you'll find out how accurate I am with this rifle." Xavier tipped his hat. "Yes, madam, you won't regret it." But as he led his horse toward the barn, Savannah already feared she might. The next morning arrived with a symphony of unfamiliar sounds that roused Savannah from her fitful sleep. The clang of metal, the rhythmic scrape of a saw, and the hammering of nails pulled her to the window. In the early dawn light, she saw Xavier already at work mending the corral fence. She dressed quickly, curiosity and suspicion battling within her. By the time she stepped onto the porch, he had already repaired a 10-foot section of fencing. "Didn't ask you to do that," she called out, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Xavier paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Ranch needs to look respectable if we're going to attract buyers for horses. And where exactly are these horses coming from?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest. "There's a wild herd in the foothills east of here. Spotted them on my way in. Good stock, Spanish bloodlines." Savannah frowned. "Wild Mustangs, that's your plan. Even if you could catch them, breaking wild horses takes weeks." "Not the way I do it," Xavier said, something akin to pride flickering across his features. "I don't break them, I gentle them," she scoffed. "And I suppose you talk to them too." "As a matter of fact, I do. Horses understand more than people give them credit for." Against her better judgment, Savannah found herself intrigued. "Breakfast is ready whenever you want it. Nothing fancy, just biscuits and coffee." Xavier nodded his thanks and returned to his work. As she turned back toward the house, Savannah couldn't help but notice the way the rising sun glinted off his dark hair, or how his shirt stretched across broad shoulders as he lifted another fence rail into place. She pushed those observations aside. Xavier Kane was a means to an end, nothing more. Just a temporary ally in her fight to save her home. Over the next 3 days, Xavier transformed the neglected corral into a sturdy enclosure suitable for wild horses. Savannah found herself watching him work from the kitchen window more often than she cared to admit. There was something hypnotic about the economy of his movements, the quiet competence in everything he did. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him gone, his palomino missing from the barn. She told herself the twist of disappointment in her stomach was merely concern about her failing plan to save the ranch. By midday, that explanation was wearing thin. As the sun began its westward descent, she heard hoofbeats approaching. She stepped onto the porch to see Xavier returning, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, tethered with long lead ropes, were 3 mustangs, a black stallion with a white blaze, a chestnut mare, and a bay gelding. All were beautiful, their coats gleaming with health despite their untamed state. "How did you," she began, but stopped as she noticed the horses were following willingly without struggle or fear. Xavier dismounted, his face streaked with dust but his eyes bright with satisfaction. "Told you I had a way with them." "Those are wild horses," Savannah said, descending the porch steps in wonder. "They should be trying to bolt." "Made friends first," he explained, leading the small herd toward the corral. "Spent days letting them get used to my scent, my voice." Approached the gentlest one, then the others followed. She shook her head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it." "Most people try to force submission," he said, opening the corral gate. "I prefer trust." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. Savannah found herself looking away, uncomfortable with how those gray eyes seemed to see through her carefully constructed walls. "Will they stay?" she asked, gesturing toward the corral where the horses now stood, occasionally pawing at the ground but making no attempt to escape. "They'll stay," Xavier confirmed. "But the real work starts tomorrow." As the days passed, Savannah was drawn inexorably to the corral, where Xavier worked his particular magic with the wild horses. His methods were unlike anything she had witnessed before. He spent hours simply sitting in the enclosure, sometimes reading aloud from a dog-eared book of poetry he carried in his saddlebag. The horses gradually approached, curious about this strange human who asked nothing of them. When he finally placed a blanket on the chestnut mare's back, the animal merely flicked an ear in response. By the end of the 2nd week, he was sitting astride the black stallion, guiding it around the corral with nothing but gentle pressure from his legs and soft words. "You should try," he suggested one evening as Savannah leaned on the fence watching him brush down the bay gelding. She shook her head. "I'm no horse whisperer, neither was I until necessity taught me." He held out the brush. "The bay likes you, he watches when you come near." Reluctantly, Savannah took the brush and entered the corral. The gelding regarded her with intelligent eyes but didn't retreat as she approached. "Easy movements," Xavier coached. "Let him come to you if he wants." To her surprise, the horse did exactly that, extending his muzzle to sniff her hand. She began brushing his neck, marveling at the muscle beneath the glossy coat. "See, natural," Xavier said, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Savannah became acutely aware of his proximity, of the scent of leather and pine that clung to him. She stepped away, creating distance. "I should check on dinner," she said, handing back the brush. That night, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them felt charged with unspoken things. Savannah found herself studying Xavier when he wasn't looking the way his hands cradled his coffee cup, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. "Why are you really here, Mr. Kane?" she asked suddenly. "There are plenty of ranches between here and wherever you're headed, ones that could pay actual wages." Xavier set down his cup, meeting her gaze directly. "Running from something, I suppose, same as most folks out here." "And what would that be? A past that doesn't much matter anymore." He paused. "What about you? Why stay and fight for this place when you could start fresh somewhere else?" Savannah looked away toward the window where darkness pressed against the glass. "This land is all I have left of John, my husband. We built this place from nothing. His blood and sweat are in this soil. And yours, Xavier pointed out. You're fighting for your own dream too, not just his memory. The observation caught her off guard. Few had ever seen her as separate from her role as John's widow. Perhaps, she conceded. Though sometimes I wonder if I'm just too stubborn to admit defeat. Xavier's lips curved into a slight smile. Stubbornness is an underrated virtue in these parts. The following week brought their first potential buyer, a horse trader passing through on his way to Wyoming. The man examined the 3 Mustangs with a critical eye, watching as Xavier demonstrated how responsive they were to commands. Fine animals, the trader admitted. But wild-caught, I don't know, my clients prefer established bloodlines. Try riding the bay, Xavier suggested. See for yourself. Skeptical but curious, the trader mounted the gelding. His eyebrows rose in surprise as the horse responded immediately to his guidance, moving with fluid grace around the corral. I'll take the bay, he said when he dismounted. $40. Savannah started to agree, but Xavier spoke first. 60. He's gentle enough for a lady to ride, but has the stamina for long trails. The trader frowned. 50, not a penny more. 55, Xavier countered, and will include a decent saddle. After a moment's consideration, the trader nodded. Deal. As Savannah watched the bay gelding being led away, she felt an unexpected pang of loss. In just a few weeks, she had grown attached to the animal's gentle nature. $55, Xavier said, handing her the money. A good start, she nodded, calculating in her head. Still a long way from 300. Word will spread. More buyers will come. That night, a spring storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain that hammered against the roof and windows. Savannah sat by the fire, mending a shirt by the flickering light. A particularly violent gust rattled the house, and she glanced toward the door, thinking of Xavier in the drafty barn. After a moment's hesitation, she set aside her sewing and pulled on a heavy shawl. The rain soaked her in the short dash to the barn, and she pushed through the door breathless and dripping. Xavier looked up from where he sat on a hay bale, surprise evident on his face. Mrs. Klein, everything all right, I thought, she began, suddenly feeling foolish. It's a terrible night to be out here, he stood, concern replacing surprise. You're soaked through. Here. He shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it enveloped her immediately, along with his scent. There's a spare room in the house, she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. No sense in you catching your death out here. Something flickered in his eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. If you're sure. It's just practical, she said, as if convincing herself. Can't sell horses if you're laid up with pneumonia. The walk back to the house seemed both eternal and far too brief. Inside, Savannah showed him to the small bedroom off the kitchen, originally intended as a nursery, though that dream had never materialized during her marriage. It's not much, she apologized, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. It's more than enough, Xavier said quietly. Thank you. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness that had nothing to do with practicality or business arrangements. Savannah stepped back. Well, good night, Mr. Kane, Xavier, he corrected gently. After all this time, I think we can use first names, don't you? She hesitated, then nodded. Good night, Xavier. Good night, Savannah. As she retreated to her own bedroom, Savannah was acutely conscious of his presence in her home, no longer a figure in the distant barn, but just on the other side of the wall. She lay awake listening to the storm, wondering what twist of fate had brought this enigmatic man to her failing ranch, and why the sound of her name on his lips made her heart beat faster than it had in years. Morning brought clear skies and an unfamiliar domestic tableau. Xavier was already awake when Savannah emerged from her room, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the kitchen. He stood at her stove with an ease that suggested this wasn't his first time preparing a meal. Hope you don't mind, he said, glancing over his shoulder. Thought I'd make myself useful. Savannah paused in the doorway, struck by the strange intimacy of the moment. Not at all. They ate breakfast together, the conversation flowing more easily than before. Xavier spoke of his travels through the territories, of the 2 years he'd spent working cattle drives from Texas, of a winter living with the Crow people who had taught him their ways with horses. And before that, Savannah asked, curious about the parts of his past he consistently omitted. A shadow crossed his face. Before that isn't worth mentioning. She wanted to press further but recognized the walls he'd built around certain memories, walls not unlike her own. Instead, she shared stories of her life before Montana, her childhood in Missouri, her father's dry goods store, the societal expectations she'd never quite managed to meet. John was the only suitor who didn't mind that I preferred riding to embroidery and had opinions on politics, she explained. When he proposed heading west to start a ranch, I agreed without hesitation. You loved him very much, Xavier observed, his voice gentle. I did. He was a good man. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. His death was unexpected pneumonia. 1 week he was healthy, the next he was gone. Xavier reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender that Savannah felt tears threaten. I'm sorry, he said simply, and in those 2 words she heard genuine understanding. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Xavier moved to the window, his posture instantly alert. 2 men, he reported. One's wearing a suit, might be from the bank. Savannah's stomach tightened. Mr. Peterson, the bank manager. She rose and smoothed her skirt, mentally calculating the money they had set aside. $55 from the Bay gelding, plus $23 she'd saved before Xavier arrived, not even a third of what they needed. Let me handle this, she said, squaring her shoulders. Xavier watched her with something like admiration. I'll be right behind you. Peterson dismounted with the awkward movements of a man unaccustomed to horses. His companion, a burly individual with a deputy's badge, remained astride, hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. Mrs. Klein, Peterson greeted, removing his hat. I was passing by and thought I'd check on your situation. Savannah stood on the porch, arms folded across her chest. My situation is progressing, Mr. Peterson. I'll have your money by the deadline. Peterson's gaze shifted to Xavier, who stood slightly behind Savannah. Something like recognition flashed in the banker's eyes. I see you've hired help, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Interesting choice. Xavier stepped forward. The lady said she'll have your money. Peterson's companion leaned forward in his saddle. You best watch your tone, stranger. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Savannah sensed a tension that went beyond the foreclosure threat, but before she could speak, Peterson broke the standoff. Very well, Mrs. Klein. The deadline stands first of the month. He replaced his hat. Though I should warn you, there's been interest in this property from other quarters, several in fact. This land isn't for sale, Savannah said firmly. It's mortgaged, and I intend to keep it that way with all payments current. Peterson mounted his horse with effort. We shall see. As the men rode away, Savannah turned to Xavier, whose jaw was set in a hard line as he watched their departure. You know him? She asked. No, Xavier said too quickly, but I know his type. Using the letter of the law to take what isn't theirs. Savannah wasn't convinced his reaction was so generalized, but she had more pressing concerns. We need more horses. Xavier nodded, his expression softening as he looked at her. I'll head out at first light tomorrow. There's another herd in the high meadows, smaller but good stock. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Savannah found herself more at ease in Xavier's company than she had been with anyone since John's death. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and reassuring without being intrusive. Do you ever think about settling somewhere? She asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Finding a place to call home, Xavier considered the question, his profile outlined against the fading light. Used to think a man like me wasn't meant for roots, that I'd always be moving on before trouble caught up. And now, his eyes met hers and something in their depths made her breath catch. Now I'm not so sure. Before she could respond, a flicker of movement caught her attention, a rider approaching fast through the gathering dusk. Xavier was on his feet in an instant, one hand moving to the pistol at his hip. As the rider drew closer, Savannah recognized Martha Wilson from the neighboring ranch 5 miles east. Savannah, Martha called out, pulling her lathered horse to a stop. Thank goodness. It's Jimmy, he's fallen down the old mine shaft on your north ridge. Rob's gone for the doctor, but we need help now. Jimmy was Martha's 8-year-old son, a freckle-faced boy who sometimes helped with chores at Savannah's ranch. I'll get lanterns and rope, Savannah said, already moving. Xavier touched her arm. I know that shaft. Saw it while tracking the Mustangs. It's deep, we'll need more than rope. Within minutes, they were mounted and following Martha through the darkening landscape. Xavier rode ahead, his Palomino sure-footed on the rocky terrain that led to the abandoned mining claim at the northern edge of Savannah's property. Rob Wilson was at the shaft entrance, calling down to his son. The worry etched on his face deepened the lines that years of hard living had already carved there. He's alive, Rob reported as they dismounted. Says his legs hurt bad. Can't climb. Xavier peered down the shaft, holding a lantern over the opening. Its light barely penetrated the darkness. I can see him, he said after a moment. About 40 feet down on a ledge. He turned to Savannah. There's an old mining cart track running down the side. If we can rig a harness, I can use it to reach him. I'll go, Rob insisted, but Xavier shook his head. With respect, sir, you're broader in the shoulder than I am. That shaft is narrow. I've got a better chance of fitting through. While Martha stayed by the shaft talking to Jimmy to keep him calm, Savannah worked with Xavier and Rob to fashion a makeshift harness from rope and leather straps. Be careful, she told Xavier as he prepared to descend. The fear in her voice surprised her with its intensity. He caught her hand briefly. Always am. The next 30 minutes were among the most harrowing of Savannah's life. She helped Rob lower Xavier inch by inch into the darkness, feeling every shudder of the rope, every jerk as he navigated the treacherous descent. When they heard his distant voice calling that he'd reached Jimmy, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Getting both Xavier and the injured boy back to the surface was a painstaking process. By the time they emerged, Jimmy cradled in Xavier's arms. Pale but conscious Savannah's hands were raw from the rope, and her arms trembled with exertion. The doctor arrived shortly after, confirming that Jimmy had a broken leg but would recover fully. The gratitude in Martha and Rob's eyes as they departed with their son was payment enough, but Rob insisted on pressing 2 gold eagles into Xavier's hand. For saving our boy, he said gruffly. And there's more where that came from if you ever need work. Later, as Savannah tended to the rope burns on Xavier's hands by the light of the kitchen lamp, she found it difficult to meet his eyes. You could have been killed, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Worth the risk, he replied. The boy needed help. Most men would have waited for the doctor. Xavier winced slightly as she applied salve to his abrasions. I'm not most men. No, Savannah agreed, finally looking up at him. You certainly aren't. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since his arrival. Before either could speak, however, exhaustion claimed them both, and they retired to their separate rooms, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The rescue at the mine shaft changed things in the valley. Word spread quickly of Xavier's bravery, and with it came increased interest in the horses he was gentling. Buyers began arriving at the ranch, first a trickle, then a steady stream. The chestnut mare went to a cavalry officer passing through for $60. A pair of new Mustangs Xavier had brought in sold for $45 each to a stagecoach operator looking to expand his relay teams. By the 3rd week of April, they had accumulated $230, still short of their goal, but close enough that Savannah began to believe they might actually succeed. Their working relationship had evolved into something deeper, though neither had put words to the growing attraction between them. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, anticipating needs, sharing small touches that lingered just a moment too long to be casual. In the evenings, they often sat by the fire, Xavier reading aloud from his book of poetry while Savannah mended or knitted. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of themselves that they had kept hidden from others. Xavier spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his father's death in a mining accident, his mother's struggle to raise 3 boys alone. He described his brief, ill-fated stint as a lawman in Kansas before the incident that sent him wandering westward. What happened? Savannah asked gently. Sensing they were approaching the darkness he typically avoided, Xavier stared into the fire. Shot a man. A powerful man's son who thought the law didn't apply to him. He'd beaten a young woman nearly to death for refusing his advances. You were enforcing the law, Savannah pointed out. The judge and jury didn't see it that way. The girl mysteriously changed her testimony. I was charged with murder. His voice grew distant. Escaped before they could hang me, been running since. Savannah's heart ached for him. Is that why Peterson recognized you? Are you still wanted? No, Xavier said, meeting her eyes. The girl eventually told the truth. I was cleared 2 years ago, but my reputation, some still see me as a killer. Savannah reached for his hand. I see you as a good man. A man who stands up for what's right, regardless of the cost. He turned her hand over, tracing the calluses on her palm with his thumb. And I see you as the strongest woman I've ever known, fiercer than any mountain lion, more determined than any storm. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Xavier leaned forward slightly, his intention clear in his eyes. Savannah felt herself drawn toward him, her pulse quickening. Then, like a spell broken, the distant sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. They pulled apart as a rider approached at speed, shouting Savannah's name. It was Tom Jenkins, owner of the general store in town. Fire, he called as he reined his horse to a stop. The Wilsons' place is burning, the whole valley's turning out to help. Without hesitation, Savannah and Xavier saddled their horses and rode hard toward the eastern horizon, where an ominous orange glow already lit the night sky. They arrived to find chaos, the main house engulfed in flames, neighbors forming bucket brigades from the well, children and animals being led to safety. Rob Wilson stood in the yard, face blackened with soot, directing efforts to save the barn. Xavier immediately joined the men attempting to prevent the fire from spreading, while Savannah found Martha and Jimmy huddled with neighbors near the corral. How did it start? Savannah asked, wrapping a blanket around Martha's trembling shoulders. Lightning struck the roof, Martha explained, her voice hollow with shock. We were eating supper, had no warning. For hours they fought the blaze. By dawn, only smoldering ruins remained of the house that had stood for 3 generations of Wilsons. The barn and outbuildings had been saved, but the loss was devastating nonetheless. As the community gathered around the shell-shocked family, offers of help came from all directions. Savannah found herself standing beside Xavier, watching as neighbors promised lumber, labor, food, all the necessities to rebuild. This is what I never had, Xavier said quietly for her ears alone. Community, people who stand together when disaster strikes. Savannah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying, that his life of constant movement had prevented such connections, such roots. An idea formed in her mind, bold and perhaps reckless, but it felt right. The Wilsons need somewhere to stay until they can rebuild. Xavier glanced at her. You're thinking your spare room? I'm thinking the whole house, Savannah said. They need it more than I do right now. Savannah, Xavier began, concern evident in his voice. Where would you go? She met his gaze steadily. I thought perhaps we could move into the line shack on the western pasture. It's small, but sound. We could continue working with the horses from there. The implication of her words that they would share the tiny cabin hung between them. Xavier's eyes darkened with an emotion Savannah couldn't quite name. You're sure? He asked, his voice rough. I'm sure. That afternoon, after the Wilsons had accepted her offer with tearful gratitude, Savannah packed essential belongings for the move to the line shack. The tiny cabin was a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. It had been built for solitary ranch hands watching over distant herds, not for comfortable habitation. Xavier rode ahead with the first load of supplies while Savannah finished gathering what they would need. As she packed her clothes, her hand hesitated over her nightgown. The intimacy of the situation suddenly struck her with full force. 1 room, 1 bed. She and Xavier had grown close over the weeks, but this was different. This was a declaration of intent, or at least it could be interpreted as such. By the time she arrived at the line shack, the sun was low on the horizon. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Xavier had already unloaded her things, started a fire, and begun preparing a simple meal. He stepped outside as she dismounted, his expression unreadable. Got everything settled at the house? Yes. Martha said they'd look after the chickens and garden. Savannah busied herself unloading her horse, suddenly uncertain about the decision she'd made. Xavier took the bundle from her hands. I made up a pallet for myself by the fire. You take the bed. Relief and an odd disappointment mingled in Savannah's chest. You don't have to, I do, he said firmly. Your reputation matters in this valley, mine's already in tatters. They ate supper in relative silence, the small space amplifying every movement, every glance. As night fell, the awkwardness between them grew. Savannah changed behind a hastily hung blanket, hyper-aware of Xavier's presence just feet away. When she emerged in her nightgown and robe, he was carefully laying out his bedroll near the hearth, his back to her. Good night, Xavier, she said softly, slipping under the covers of the narrow bed. He glanced over, the firelight casting shadows across his features. Good night, Savannah, sleep proved elusive. Savannah lay awake, listening to Xavier's steady breathing, watching the play of firelight on the ceiling. She thought of all they had shared, all they had overcome together. Of the way his hand felt when it brushed hers, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. Xavier, she whispered into the darkness. Are you awake? Yes, came his immediate response. Savannah sat up, gathering her courage. Why did you really come to my ranch that day? Of all the places you could have stopped, why mine? The silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sat up, the blanket falling to his waist to reveal he wore only an undershirt above his trousers. I'd heard about you, he admitted. In town. About the widow fighting to save her ranch against impossible odds. It reminded me of my mother after my father died. He paused. I thought maybe I could help, make a difference for once instead of just passing through. You have, Savannah said, made a difference. Xavier's gaze held hers across the darkened room. And now I don't want you to leave when this is over. The words surprised even her with their directness. Xavier stood in one fluid motion and crossed to the bed, kneeling beside it. His face was inches from hers, his eyes reflecting the dying firelight. Is that what you truly want? He asked, his voice a low rumble. A wanted man with no prospects beyond his way with horses. Savannah reached out, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. I want you. The rest we'll figure out together. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent a shiver through her entire body. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he cupped her face and brought his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question being asked and answered. Then it deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring out between them. Savannah's hands found their way into his hair, drawing him closer, while his arms encircled her waist. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first week, he confessed. Why didn't you? She asked, her fingers still tangled in his hair. Because you deserve better than a drifter who could bring trouble to your door. His voice was rough with emotion. You deserve a man who can promise forever. And is that what you're promising now? Savannah asked, her heart beating wildly in her chest. Xavier drew back slightly to meet her eyes. If you'll have me, if you'll take that chance. Instead of answering, Savannah kissed him again, pouring all her feelings into the gesture. When they parted, she moved over in the narrow bed, making space beside her. Xavier hesitated, his expression torn between desire and propriety. Savannah, your reputation will survive, she finished for him. Hold me, Xavier, that's all I'm asking for tonight. After a moment's consideration, he slid under the covers beside her, gathering her against his chest. The feeling of being held after so long alone brought unexpected tears to Savannah's eyes. I'll sleep alone, she whispered against his shoulder. Xavier's arms tightened around her. Not while my arms are empty, he murmured into her hair, in the shelter of his embrace. Savannah felt something she had thought lost, forever hope for a future filled with love and possibility. The next morning brought new challenges. A quick check of their finances revealed they were still $60 short of the $300 needed to satisfy the bank. With only 10 days remaining before the deadline, time was running dangerously thin. We need one more good sale. Xavier said over breakfast, or several smaller ones. Savannah nodded, trying to focus on practical matters despite the way her body still tingled from waking in Xavier's arms. The black stallion could bring a good price. He's the finest of all the horses you've gentled. Xavier's expression grew thoughtful. He is, but I had other plans for him. Before he could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of Rob Wilson. The rancher looked exhausted but determined as he dismounted outside the line shack. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, removing his hat. "Just wanted to thank you again for the house. Martha and the children are settling in." "It's the least we could do," Savannah assured him. "How are plans for rebuilding?" "That's partly why I'm here." Rob shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Word is the bank's about to foreclose on your place, Savannah." She stiffened slightly. "We're working on it. Thing is," Rob continued, "I've been thinking, with our house gone, we'll need to rebuild from scratch. Takes money we don't readily have, but if we pooled our resources." He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "What if we combined our operations?" "The Wilson Klein Ranch has a nice ring to it." Savannah blinked in surprise. "You're proposing a partnership?" Rob nodded. "Your land, our cattle and equipment. Split everything down the middle. First order of business would be paying off the bank, of course." It was a generous offer, one that would solve her immediate financial problems. Yet Savannah hesitated, glancing at Xavier, who stood silently by her side. "I appreciate the offer, Rob," she said carefully, "but I need some time to consider it." After Rob departed, promising to respect whatever decision she made, Savannah turned to Xavier. The tension in his jaw told her he was troubled. "What is it?" she asked. Rob's offer would solve everything. Xavier met her gaze, his eyes stormy. "Is that what you want?" "A partnership with the Wilsons? I want to keep my land," Savannah replied. "Beyond that, I'm not sure." "What about us?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all they had shared the night before. Savannah stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest. "That's the most important part of any decision I make." His expression softened, and he covered her hand with his own. "I meant what I said last night. If you want me to stay, I will." "Then stay," she said simply. "Whatever else happens, stay with me." Their kiss was a promise, deep and unhurried. When they parted, Xavier's smile held a hint of mischief. "In that case, I think it's time I showed you what I've been planning with that black stallion." He led her to where the magnificent horse now grazed near the line shack. Over the past weeks, the stallion had transformed from a wild creature to a confident, well-trained mount. His coat gleamed in the morning sun, muscles rippling beneath the sleek black hide. "He's special," Xavier explained, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Spanish bloodlines, but there's something else there, Arabian, maybe. He's intelligent, fast, and he has heart. He could be the foundation of something important." "What do you mean?" "A breeding program," Xavier said, his eyes alight with possibility. "Quality stock is hard to find out here. But with the right mares, this stallion could sire horses that would be sought after throughout the territories." Understanding dawned on Savannah. "You're talking about turning the ranch into a horse operation." Xavier nodded. "Not just breaking wild mustangs, but breeding and training superior horses. It would take time to establish, but eventually. It could be more profitable than cattle," Savannah finished, her mind racing with the possibilities. "Especially in this terrain." "It's just an idea," Xavier said, suddenly hesitant. "The land is yours. The decision is yours." Savannah looked from him to the stallion, then across the rolling landscape of her ranch, the ranch she had fought so hard to save. She thought of John, of the cattle operation he had envisioned, of the life they had planned together. But John was gone, and she was still here, still living, still dreaming. "Our idea," she corrected, taking his hand. "Our land, if you're willing to make that commitment." The joy that spread across Xavier's face was like the sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I can think of no greater honor than building something lasting with you." With renewed purpose, they rode into town that afternoon to speak with Peterson at the bank. Xavier had formulated a proposal. They would pay the $240 they had already accumulated, with the balance to be paid within 30 days, secured by a bill of sale on 2 additional horses they were currently training. Peterson listened with thinly veiled skepticism, his gaze continually shifting to Xavier with undisguised dislike. "Insufficient," he pronounced when Xavier finished speaking. "The full amount is due on the 1st, as agreed." "We're offering most of it now," Savannah argued, "with guaranteed payment of the remainder within weeks. The terms of the mortgage are clear, Mrs. Klein." Peterson shuffled papers on his desk. $300 by the 1st of the month or foreclosure proceedings begin." Xavier leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "This isn't about the money, is it, Peterson? It's about me." The banker's expression hardened. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You recognized me that day at the ranch. You know who I am or who you think I am." Peterson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Kane. A man who takes the law into his own hands is not the sort we welcome in this community." "A man who stands up against injustice," Savannah corrected, anger rising in her chest. "A man who risked his life to save a child. That's who Xavier Kane is." "Nevertheless," Peterson said, unmoved, "my decision stands. Full payment by the deadline or the ranch will be sold at auction." Outside the bank, Savannah struggled to contain her frustration. "He's being deliberately obstinate. The difference is only $60. Xavier's expression was grim. "It's not about the money. Peterson has other interests at stake. The question is, what are they?" Their answer came unexpectedly the following morning when a luxurious carriage pulled up to the Line shack. The man who stepped down was expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of wealth and influence. "Mrs. Klein?" he inquired, removing his hat to reveal silvering hair. "I'm Harrison Montgomery, representing Western mining interests. I understand your property may soon be available." Savannah's back stiffened. "My ranch is not for sale, Mr. Montgomery." The man smiled indulgently. "According to the bank, that situation may change very soon. I merely wanted to introduce myself and express my company's interest in acquiring your land. We're prepared to offer a very generous sum, far more than its value as a cattle ranch." "Why would a mining company want my land?" Savannah asked, suspicion growing. "There's no significant mineral deposits here." "Actually, there are," Montgomery corrected smoothly. "Our geological survey suggests substantial copper deposits in the northern section of your property. The very area where that unfortunate accident with the Wilson boy occurred." Xavier stepped forward, his expression hard. "And when did you conduct this survey?" Montgomery hesitated, his gaze sharpening as he took in Xavier's protective stance beside Savannah. "Several months ago, with the proper permissions, of course." "From whom?" Savannah demanded. "I never gave permission for anyone to survey my land. The bank holds your mortgage, Mrs. Klein. In certain circumstances, they have the authority to grant access for assessment purposes." Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, I'm authorized to offer you $500 for the ranch, immediate payment, no waiting for auction." Savannah felt Xavier tense beside her. "So this is why Peterson won't accept our partial payment," she said, understanding dawning. "He's in league with your company." Montgomery's expression hardened slightly. "I wouldn't know about the bank's internal policies. My concern is simply acquiring promising mining properties." "My concern is keeping my home," Savannah replied firmly. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Montgomery, but as I said, the ranch is not for sale." After the mining representative departed, his offer rejected but his card left, "in case you reconsider." Savannah and Xavier pieced together the situation. Peterson had likely been promised a handsome commission for ensuring the mining company could acquire the ranch cheaply at auction. The supposed foreclosure was merely a convenient mechanism. "We need that $60, Savannah said, determination hardening her resolve, "and we need it within the week." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "There's a horse auction in Helena the day after tomorrow. If we leave at first light, we could make it with the stallion. But I thought you wanted to keep him for breeding." "I do, but keeping the ranch comes first." He touched her cheek gently. "We can always find another stallion." The journey to Helena was arduous, 2 full days of hard riding, leading the black stallion and a pack horse carrying their supplies. They arrived dusty and exhausted, with barely enough time to register for the auction scheduled for the following morning. Helena bustled with activity miners, merchants, ranchers, and travelers, creating a vibrant tapestry of frontier life. After securing rooms at a modest hotel and stabling their horses, Xavier and Savannah walked the busy streets, discussing their strategy for the auction. "We need at least $80, Xavier calculated, 60 for the bank plus enough for our return journey. Do you think the stallion will bring that much?" Savannah asked, worry creasing her brow, more if the right buyers are present. Xavier squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Try not to worry. One way or another, we'll save the ranch." That evening, as they shared a quiet meal in the hotel's dining room, Xavier seemed preoccupied, his gaze frequently drifting to the other patrons. "Is something wrong?" Savannah asked after he checked the entrance for the third time. Xavier hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's a man at the bar who keeps watching us. Don't look now, but he's wearing a brown coat with a silver watch chain." Savannah casually glanced in that direction when reaching for her water glass. The man in question was middle-aged, with a neatly trimmed beard and the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "Do you know him?" she asked quietly. "No," Xavier admitted, "but he knows me, or thinks he does." The uneasiness that had plagued them since leaving the ranch intensified. After dinner, they retired to their separate rooms, propriety demanded by their unmarried status despite the intimacy they had shared at the line shack. Savannah lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the busy town and worrying about the auction, about Peterson's machinations, about the watching stranger. Finally, unable to sleep, she wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and slipped out onto the small balcony adjoining her room. The night air was cool against her skin as she gazed at the stars above Helena's rooftops. The sound of her door opening startled her, and she turned to find Xavier entering cautiously. "I knocked," he explained quickly. "But then I heard a noise on the balcony and worried." "It's just me," Savannah assured him. "I couldn't sleep." Xavier joined her at the railing, his presence both comforting and exhilarating. "Neither could I, too much riding on tomorrow." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, shoulders touching. Then Xavier turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Savannah, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said before." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" "If things go wrong tomorrow, if we don't get enough for the stallion, or if Peterson finds some other way to take the ranch." He took her hands in his. "I want you to know that it doesn't change how I feel. Where you go, I go, ranch or no ranch." Tears pricked at Savannah's eyes. "Xavier, I love you," he said simply. "I think I started falling the moment you pointed that rifle at me on your porch. I just didn't have the right to say it until I knew I could offer you something more than a drifter's life." Savannah reached up to touch his face, tracing the features that had become so dear to her. "You've offered me everything that matters: hope, partnership, a future I can believe in." She rose on tiptoes to brush her lips against his. "I love you too." Their kiss deepened, months of restrained desire finally finding expression. Xavier's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against the solid warmth of his body. Savannah's hands slid into his hair, holding him close as if afraid he might disappear. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Whatever happens tomorrow, be my wife." "Yes," Savannah answered without hesitation. Yes, morning brought renewed determination. They arrived at the auction grounds early to ensure the black stallion was properly presented. Xavier spent an hour grooming the magnificent animal until his coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the sunlight. Potential buyers wandered among the horses up for auction, evaluating bloodlines, conformation, and temperament. The black stallion drew considerable attention, with several men returning for second and third looks. "That's a fine piece of horseflesh," commented a tall man in a brocade vest. "Spanish breeding, Spanish with Arabian influences, we believe," Xavier replied, maintaining the careful balance between honesty and salesmanship. "He's gentle but spirited, responds to the lightest touch." The man nodded appreciatively. "I'll be keeping an eye on him when he comes up." As the auction began, Savannah and Xavier took seats near the front of the viewing area. Lot after lot was presented, some fetching impressive prices, others going for bargain rates. The variable nature of the bidding did nothing to calm Savannah's nerves. "Lot 27, announced the auctioneer eventually. "Black stallion, 5 years old, gentled from wild stock." Xavier squeezed Savannah's hand as their horse was led into the ring. The stallion moved with natural grace, head high, nostrils flaring slightly at the scents of so many unfamiliar humans and animals. "Starting bid at $30, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 30? Several hands went up immediately. Savannah's heart began to race as the bidding quickly climbed. $40, $45, $50. The man in the brocade vest entered the bidding at $60, only to be immediately countered by a grizzled rancher near the back. Back and forth the price rose $70, $80, $90. Savannah clutched Xavier's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. $100, called a new voice. Savannah turned to see the bearded man who had been watching them in the hotel. $110, countered brocade vest. $120, responded the bearded man without hesitation. The bidding continued to climb until it reached $150, an impressive sum for a horse of unknown lineage. When the auctioneer's hammer fell, the black stallion belonged to the bearded stranger. "That's 3 times what we needed," Savannah whispered, relief and regret mingling in her voice as they watched their magnificent horse being led away. Xavier nodded, his expression difficult to read. "Let's collect the money and head back. If we ride hard, we can make it to the bank before Peterson's deadline." As they made their way to the payment office, the bearded man intercepted them. Up close, Savannah could see intelligence in his deep-set eyes. "Mr. Kane," he said by way of greeting, "been a while." Xavier's posture stiffened slightly. "Do we know each other?" The man smiled thinly. "Marshal James Harker. We met briefly in Dodge City some years back." He turned to Savannah. "Mrs. Klein, I presume. I've heard about your situation." Savannah glanced at Xavier, whose face had gone carefully blank. "What do you want, Marshal?" she asked directly. "Just a conversation," Harker assured them. "Perhaps over coffee." They found themselves in a quiet corner of a nearby cafe, the marshal watching them over the rim of his cup with thoughtful eyes. "That's a fine stallion," he commented. "Hate to separate him from someone who clearly cares for him so well." "If you're here about Xavier's past," Savannah began, but Harker raised a hand to stop her. "I know all about Mr. Kane's situation. The charges were dropped years ago, as I'm sure he's told you." The marshal set down his cup. "I'm not here about the past. I'm here about your future specifically, the future of your ranch." Xavier leaned forward. "What do you know about our ranch?" "I know Harrison Montgomery and his mining operation have been trying to get their hands on it. I know they've been working with your bank manager to manipulate the foreclosure." Harker's expression hardened. "What you may not know is that they've been using similar tactics throughout the territory, identifying properties with mineral potential, creating financial hardships for the owners, then swooping in to purchase at a fraction of the true value." "That's criminal," Savannah said, outrage coloring her voice. "It is indeed, which is why the federal government has been building a case against them." Harker reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "This contains a federal injunction preventing Peterson from foreclosing on your property pending investigation into his business practices." Savannah stared at the document in disbelief. "You mean the ranch is safe, Mrs. Klein, at least for now?" Harker smiled slightly. "And as for the stallion, consider him a wedding present." Xavier's eyebrows rose. "How did you small towns, big ears?" the marshal explained with a shrug. "The hotel maid mentioned overhearing a proposal last night." Savannah blushed, but her embarrassment was overshadowed by overwhelming relief and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. Just build something good," Harker said, standing to leave. "The West needs more people putting down roots, creating something that lasts." He extended a hand to Xavier. "Good luck to you both." The journey back to the ranch was considerably lighter in spirit than their departure had been. With the stallion following on a lead rope and the injunction safely tucked into Savannah's saddlebag, they rode at a more leisurely pace, planning their future together. "We'll marry as soon as we return," Xavier decided. "No reason to wait." "None at all," Savannah agreed, happiness bubbling through her like a spring. though Martha will insist on at least some semblance of a proper wedding. Whatever makes you happy, Xavier said, reaching across to take her hand. Though I draw the line at one of those eastern tailcoats, Savannah laughed, the sound echoing across the open prairie. I think your usual attire will do just fine. They were a day's ride from home when they encountered Rob Wilson heading toward town with a wagon load of lumber for his rebuilding project. You're back early, he observed, pulling his team to a stop. Any luck at the auction? Better than luck, Savannah replied, quickly explaining about Marshall Harker and the injunction against Peterson. Rob whistled low. Always knew that banker was a snake, so the ranch is safe. It is, Xavier confirmed. And we've decided to focus on horse breeding rather than cattle. Starting with this fellow. He patted the black stallion's neck. Rob studied the horse with an appreciative eye. Fine animal. Could be the start of something substantial. He glanced between them, noting their clasped hands and easy intimacy. And it looks like that's not the only new beginning around here. Savannah smiled, leaning slightly toward Xavier. We're getting married as soon as we return. Well now, that calls for a celebration, Rob declared. Martha will want to help with arrangements. After all you've done for us, it's the least we can offer. As Rob predicted, their return to the ranch set off a flurry of activity. Martha Wilson, despite being displaced from her home, threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm. Women from neighboring ranches brought food, flowers, and offers of assistance. Men volunteered to set up tables and benches in the yard. 3 days after their return, Savannah stood in her bedroom in the main house, where Martha had insisted she prepare for the ceremony. Her wedding dress was simple, a cream-colored gown with lace at the collar and cuffs that she had ordered from a catalog months before John's death, but never had occasion to wear. Martha had altered it slightly to better fit Savannah's frame. You look beautiful, Martha said, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Savannah's upswept hair. John would want this for you, you know, your happiness. Tears pricked at Savannah's eyes. I think he somehow led Xavier to me in a way. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Rob Wilson, who had offered to walk Savannah to the makeshift altar in the absence of her father. It's time, he said, offering his arm. And if I may say so, you're the prettiest bride this valley has ever seen. Outside, the ranch yard had been transformed. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between posts, waiting to be lit as evening fell. Benches had been arranged in rows, now filled with neighbors and friends. At the far end, beneath an arch of twisted willow branches and spring flowers, stood Xavier. He had refused to wear a borrowed suit, opting instead for clean, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a new vest. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaven. But it was his expression, as he watched Savannah approach, that transformed him. Wonder and love and certainty all mingled together. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a circuit preacher who had fortuitously been passing through the area. The traditional vows were spoken with clear voices that carried across the assembled gathering. When Xavier placed a simple gold band on Savannah's finger purchased in Helena with a small portion of their auction money, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Xavier's kiss was tender, mindful of their audience, yet conveying a promise of deeper intimacies to come. When they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, the applause and cheers echoed across the valley. The celebration lasted well into the night. There was music from fiddles and harmonicas, dancing on the hard, packed earth of the yard, food and drink shared among friends and neighbors. Stories were told, toasts were made. Advice both ribald and sincere was offered to the newlyweds. As the festivities began to wind down, Savannah found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching as Xavier conversed with a group of men near one of the bonfires. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the smile that came more readily now than when he had first arrived at her gate. Martha appeared at her side, following her gaze. You chose well, she said quietly, a good man with a good heart. Yes, Savannah agreed, I did. Later, after the guests had departed and the night had grown still, Savannah and Xavier walked hand in hand toward the lined shack that had become their temporary home. Stars blazed overhead, the Milky Way a luminous river across the velvet sky. "Happy, Mrs. Kane?" Xavier asked, drawing her close against his side. Savannah smiled at the sound of her new name. "Perfectly." Inside the small cabin, a fire burned low in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. Xavier closed the door behind them and turned to his bride, his expression suddenly serious. "I meant every word of those vows," he said, taking her hands in his. "To love and cherish you all the days of my life, to build something lasting with you." Savannah stepped closer, tilting her face up to his. "As did I." Their kiss was different from those they had shared before, unhurried, yet filled with anticipation. Xavier's hands slid to her waist, drawing her against him as Savannah's arms encircled his neck. When they broke apart, breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find this, a home, a future you, nor I," Savannah whispered. "After John died, I thought that part of my life was over." Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I promise you it's just beginning." With gentle hands, he helped her remove the wreath of flowers from her hair, letting the auburn waves cascade down her back. Each touch, each caress was an exploration, a discovery of the person who would be their companion through all the days to come. As night deepened around the small cabin, they found in each other's arms the belonging they had both been seeking, a shelter from the world's hardships, a promise kept, a love freely given and joyfully received. 5 years later, the Klein-Kane Ranch was almost unrecognizable from the failing operation Savannah had fought so desperately to save. The main house had been expanded, with a new wing added for their growing family. The corral where Xavier had first gentled wild mustangs had evolved into a complex of specialized training areas and breeding facilities. Their reputation for producing exceptional horses had spread throughout Montana Territory and beyond. Buyers came from as far as St. Louis and San Francisco to purchase their stock, particularly the offspring of the black stallion they called Midnight. On a warm summer evening, Savannah stood on the porch watching as Xavier demonstrated riding techniques to their 4-year-old son, Thomas. The boy sat proudly atop a gentle pony, his face a miniature version of his father's with Savannah's auburn hair. "Straight back, Thomas," Xavier coached. "That's it, now gentle with the reins." From her place in Savannah's arms, 2-year-old Elizabeth clapped her tiny hands, eager for her turn on the pony, though she was still too young. "Mama ride too?" the little girl demanded. Savannah laughed. "Not today, sweetheart. The new baby makes it hard for Mama to ride right now." She placed a hand on her swelling abdomen, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her palm. Their third child was due as autumn approached, another blessing in a life now filled with them. Xavier caught her eye across the yard and smiled, that special smile reserved only for her. After helping Thomas dismount, he lifted the boy onto his shoulders and approached the porch. "How are my girls?" he asked, reaching up to touch Elizabeth's cheek before placing his free hand over Savannah's on her belly. "Impatient," Savannah replied with a smile. "Both of them." Thomas leaned down from his perch on Xavier's shoulders. "Papa says I can help train the new foals when they're old enough." "Did he now?" Savannah raised an eyebrow at her husband. "And what does Papa say about finishing your lessons first?" Xavier had the grace to look sheepish. "That too, of course." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across land that had flourished under their care, Savannah was struck by how far they had come from those desperate days when foreclosure loomed and her future seemed as barren as winter fields. Peterson had eventually been convicted of fraud, along with several officials from Western mining interests. The discovery of copper on the northern section of their property had indeed proved valuable, but they had negotiated a fair lease agreement with a reputable mining company rather than selling outright. The additional income had allowed them to expand their horse breeding operation faster than they had initially planned. The Wilsons had rebuilt their home and now ran a successful cattle operation adjacent to the Klein-Kane Ranch. Their son Jimmy, whose rescue from the mine shaft had cemented Xavier's reputation in the valley, often worked alongside Thomas, the two boys forming a friendship that mirrored that of their parents. After the children were tucked into bed, Savannah and Xavier sat together on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaned against his chest. "I was thinking," Xavier said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about that first night in the lined shack." Savannah smiled at the memory. "When I said I'd sleep alone, and I told you not while my arms were empty." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Best promise I ever made." "And kept," Savannah added, turning her face up for a proper kiss. Xavier obliged, his lips finding hers with the familiar ease of long practice, yet with a tenderness that had never diminished. When they parted, his hand came to rest on her rounded belly where their unborn child stirred beneath his touch. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For taking a chance on a drifter. For building this life with me, for these children." His voice held a depth of emotion that still moved her, even after all these years. Savannah placed her hand over his. "Thank you for stopping at my gate that day, for seeing possibility when all I could see was loss." As night settled fully over the ranch, they remained together on the porch, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor and love. The challenges they had faced and would undoubtedly face in years to come seemed manageable when shouldered together. The loneliness that had once defined both their lives had been replaced by a belonging so profound it seemed woven into the very fabric of the land they called home. "I love you, Savannah Kane," Xavier whispered into the gathering darkness. "And I love you," she replied, secure in the knowledge that whatever life brought their way, she would never again sleep alone, not while his arms waited to hold her.